The Galactic Conclave had catalogued 11,000 species across 4 spiral arms of the Milky Way, and in all that time, across all those stars and centuries, they had never once encountered a civilization they considered truly dangerous. Dangerous was a word they reserved for black holes, for rogue stellar events, for the cold mathematics of entropy. Individual species had their moments of aggression, yes. Territorial posturing, resource skirmishes, the occasional extinction-level miscommunication. But nothing that couldn't be managed, mediated, and filed neatly into the archives of civilized resolution. Then they found Earth. The initial survey drones had transmitted images of small, soft creatures moving in slow herds across a pale blue world, bipedal, largely hairless, equipped with neither venom nor armor, possessing no natural weapons of any particular note. The Conclave's xenobiologists had labeled them with clinical affection, as one might label a curious insect. Harmless. Curious. Perhaps, in a few thousand years, ready for integration. They sent an ambassador vessel. They expected reverence. What they did not expect was Gunnery Sergeant Elena Vasquez. She was 42 years old, built like a woman who had decided long ago that the universe owed her nothing and intended to collect accordingly. She had served 3 combat tours on 2 continents, had been decorated 4 times and court-martialed once. The charges were later dropped, the record sealed, and the general who filed them had retired quietly to a country where nobody asked too many questions. She was standing in the middle of a United Nations emergency briefing room when the Conclave's holographic envoy materialized above the central table, its bioluminescent form shifting through colors that human eyes struggled to process. The alien spoke through a translation matrix that rendered its voice as something between a cello and running water, and it said, with genuine warmth, that humanity appeared to be a gentle and manageable species, one that the Conclave was prepared to welcome under its protective umbrella, provided certain conditions were met, certain technologies surrendered, and certain sovereign decisions deferred to galactic oversight. There was a long silence in the room. Diplomats exchanged glances. Generals straightened their ties. And Gunnery Sergeant Vasquez, who had not been invited to this meeting but had escorted the Secretary General as a security detail and apparently decided that her clearance extended to opinions, leaned forward with her hands flat on the table and said, quietly, "You might want to rethink that assessment." The Conclave envoy, whose name translated approximately as Resonance of Distant Water, though the Marines in the room had already begun calling it Ripple, had genuinely believed it was being kind. That was the thing that Vasquez found most remarkable and most dangerous. It wasn't condescension born of cruelty. It was condescension born of ignorance, and in her experience, ignorance was always the more volatile compound. She asked for a screen. Someone handed her a tablet. She pulled up an image, not a weapon, not a warship, just a line of text, a legal definition, and she read it aloud into the silence of the chamber. "A war crime," she said, her voice level, "is a violation of the laws and customs of war." She paused to let the translation matrix catch up. "The fact that we have laws," she continued, "governing how we are permitted to conduct war. The fact that we sat down, after centuries of killing each other, and wrote rules about which ways of killing are acceptable, and which are not, should tell you something about us that your survey drones missed." Ripple's bioluminescence flickered. The xenobiologist aboard the Conclave vessel, monitoring remotely, would later describe the moment in her field notes as the first instance in recorded galactic history where a species had unsettled an ambassador not with a weapon, but with a legal footnote. Vasquez wasn't done. She walked the envoy through the Geneva Conventions, not as a point of pride, but as a point of context. She explained that humanity had invented mustard gas, and then banned it, had developed nuclear weapons capable of ending all complex life on the planet's surface, and had spent the subsequent decades building elaborate international frameworks to prevent their use, had created biological agents of staggering lethality, cataloged them, secured them, and argued bitterly in international courts about the ethics of their very existence. "We didn't stop making these things because we couldn't," she said. "We stopped, sometimes, because we chose to." And the choosing, she added, is the part you should be paying attention to. The room was very quiet. Even the generals had stopped fidgeting. What Ripple and the conclave had failed to understand, what 11,000 surveyed species had apparently never forced them to confront, was the specific texture of human violence. Not its existence, which was common enough across the galaxy's census of civilizations. Not even its scale, which was admittedly impressive. What was unique, what made the xenobiologists' field notes grow increasingly agitated over the next several hours, was its deliberateness. The way humanity had studied its own capacity for destruction, the way a surgeon studies anatomy, not to celebrate it, but to understand it, to contain it, and on the darkest pages of the record to refine it. Vasquez pulled up another document. The Liber Code, 1863. She explained that in the middle of a civil war that would kill more Americans than any conflict before or since, a nation had paused to codify the ethical conduct of warfare. Had argued, in the middle of catastrophic bloodshed, about what was and was not permissible. "We were shooting each other," she said, "and we still found time to write the rules." She moved through history with the efficiency of someone who had studied it not for examinations but for survival. She spoke about the firebombing of cities and the subsequent international treaties that arose from that horror. She spoke about chemical warfare, about the men who came back from the First World War with lungs that no longer worked properly, and about how that specific suffering had generated enough collective revulsion to produce a global prohibition. She spoke about the tribunals after the Second World War, the moment humanity had decided, formally and for the record, that following orders was not a sufficient defense for atrocity. That individuals, even within military hierarchies, bore personal moral responsibility for their actions. "We put our own people on trial," she said. "We convicted them. We executed some of them. Not because a foreign power made us. Because we decided that some things were wrong, and that the wrongness did not diminish because the people doing them were on our side." Ripple was silent for a long time. When it finally spoke, its voice had lost some of its melodic certainty. It asked, carefully, how many of these conventions were currently being observed. Vasquez smiled, and it was not a comfortable smile. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question." The question hung in the air of the briefing room like smoke, because the honest answer, the answer that Vasquez gave without flinching, was that compliance was imperfect, enforcement was inconsistent, and violations occurred with depressing regularity across every theater of human conflict. And yet the framework existed. The courts existed. The investigations existed. The journalists who embedded themselves in war zones and documented atrocities existed, sometimes at the cost of their lives, because someone had decided that the record mattered, that bearing witness was a form of resistance. "Every other species you've cataloged," Vasquez said, "how many of them developed weapons of mass destruction and then built international organizations specifically to limit their own access to those weapons?" Ripple consulted its database. The answer, transmitted back from the conclave vessel in orbit, arrived after a pause that was itself eloquent. The answer was 0. She let that settle. Then she told them about the Marine Corps. Not as a recruiting pitch, she was long past that particular theater, but as a case study in what she was trying to explain. She described the training, the ethics modules that sat alongside the weapons qualifications, the rules of engagement, which were not suggestions but orders, binding and enforceable, designed to thread the needle between military necessity and human dignity. She described the weight of those rules, how they pressed down on you in the field, how the hardest thing about combat was not the enemy in front of you, but the line behind you, the line you were not permitted to cross regardless of what the enemy had done, regardless of what you had lost, regardless of how much rage had accumulated in your chest like a physical pressure. "We train people," she said, "to be capable of extraordinary violence, and then we train them, simultaneously, to restrain that capability according to a moral framework. We do both things at once. We hold both things in the same body, sometimes in the same moment." She had the room. Even Ripple had gone very still, its bioluminescence a steady, thoughtful blue. "The species you should be afraid of," Vasquez said, "aren't the ones who can't control themselves. Those are manageable. Predictable. They burn bright and collapse." She paused. "The species you should think carefully about are the ones who can, who have looked at the full depth of what they're capable of, who have sat with that knowledge, who have written it down and argued about it, and gone to war over the arguments, and who choose, deliberately, moment by moment, how much of it to use." There was a tradition in the Marine Corps, informal, unwritten, passed down through generations of enlisted personnel like a prayer without a church, that went something like this: "Know what you are, so that you can choose what you do." Vasquez had heard it first from her drill instructor, a compact woman from Okinawa who had the eyes of someone who had seen the bottom of things and come back up. She had heard it again from a chaplain in a field hospital, and again from a general who was being very honest after his third drink at a retirement ceremony, and she had carried it with her the way she carried her dog tags, not as decoration, but as weight, as reminder, as anchor. It came back to her now, in this room, with an alien diplomat watching her, with something that had moved well past condescension and arrived at something closer to awe. She thought about what humanity was. Not the sanitized version, not the ambassador's talking points, the real version, the full accounting. She thought about the wars that had scarred the planet's surface, about the famines that politics had engineered, about every dark chapter that the history books debated and the survivors never forgot. And she thought about the other side of that ledger. The hospitals built in the ruins of bombed cities, the aid workers who crossed borders without weapons, the scientists who had sequenced a plague virus and immediately shared the data with every nation on Earth so that everyone could work on the cure simultaneously, the soldiers who had shielded civilians with their own bodies, the veterans who came home broken and still showed up, still voted, still coached Little League, still called their mothers. Humanity was not good. It was not simple. It was not safe. But it was trying. Every generation, imperfectly, loudly, at tremendous cost, it was trying. And that trying, that stubborn, furious, grieving refusal to accept that the worst of what they were was the final word on what they could become, was perhaps the most dangerous thing about them. Because it meant they were not finished. It meant the story was still being written. It meant that the species currently sitting across from an alien ambassador, in a room that smelled of recycled air and institutional coffee, was not the species that would be sitting there in 100 years. They would be something more. Something harder to categorize. Something that had looked into the deepest parts of itself and kept moving forward anyway. Ripple's final transmission to the conclave that evening was brief. It recommended, in the formal language of galactic diplomacy, that humanity's classification be immediately revised. Not to hostile. Not to dangerous, in the crude sense that word implied across the conclave's files. The recommended classification, which would be debated for years in galactic academic circles, was something that translated roughly as a species in the process of becoming. Handle accordingly. Do not underestimate. Do not provoke. And above all, do not assume you understand them. They do not yet fully understand themselves, and they are working on it with everything they have. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Vasquez walked out of the briefing room into a hallway that smelled like floor wax and history. She stopped at a water fountain, took a long drink, and straightened up. Outside the windows, the stars were doing what they always did, burning quietly, indifferent and eternal. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, steadily, without illusion, without fear. Humanity had explained itself today. Not perfectly. Not completely. But honestly. And sometimes, she had learned, honestly is enough to change everything. Share.